We're just weeks away from 2026, and I need to tell you something that most spiritual teachers won't. Your awakening next year isn't going to happen because of what you start doing, it's going to happen because of what you stop doing right now. As we approach this powerful year one energy of 2026, millions of people are making lists of new spiritual practices to begin, new courses to take, new meditation techniques to try. But they're missing the fundamental truth about awakening. It's not about addition, it's about subtraction. Your awakening is already trying to emerge. It's been knocking at the door of your consciousness for months, maybe years. But there are 7 specific things you're doing, unconsciously, that are keeping that door locked from the inside. These aren't obvious spiritual mistakes like negative thinking or skipping meditation. These are subtler, more insidious patterns that even advanced spiritual seekers fall into. They're so normalized in our culture that most people don't even recognize them as barriers to awakening. Here's what makes the next few weeks so crucial. 2026 is a year one in numerology, a time of new beginnings and fresh starts. But you can't build something new on a foundation of old patterns. You can't step into your awakened self while still engaging in behaviors that keep you spiritually asleep. The 7 things I'm about to share aren't just suggestions, they're requirements. If you want to enter 2026 as the awakened version of yourself, you must be willing to stop these patterns before January 1st. This is your wake-up call. When I talk about awakening in 2026, I'm not referring to some mystical experience where you suddenly see angels or have cosmic visions. Real awakening is far more practical and profound than that. It's the moment when you stop living from your conditioned patterns and start living from your authentic soul essence. Awakening is the shift from unconscious reaction to conscious response. It's when you stop being a victim of your circumstances and start being the conscious creator of your reality. It's the difference between sleepwalking through life and living with full presence and intentionality. But here's what the spiritual industry won't tell you. Awakening isn't something you achieve through accumulation, more knowledge, more techniques, more experiences. Awakening happens through elimination. It's about removing the layers of conditioning, the habitual patterns, the unconscious behaviors that keep you trapped in old versions of yourself. Think of it like this. Your true self is like a sculpture that already exists within a block of marble. The awakening process isn't about adding anything to the marble, it's about chipping away everything that isn't the sculpture. Every pattern you release, every unconscious behavior you stop, reveals more of who you really are. Right now, in these final weeks of 2025, we have an unprecedented opportunity to break free from patterns that have been running our lives for years, maybe decades. The energy is building toward 2026's year one vibration, a cosmic reset that supports new beginnings. But this window requires preparation. You can't just flip a switch on January 1st and expect transformation. The 7 patterns we're going to explore aren't just random behaviors, they're the most common ways that spiritually oriented people unconsciously sabotage their own awakening. They're so subtle that you might be doing them right now without realizing it. Understanding these patterns is crucial because each one creates a specific type of energetic resistance that blocks your natural awakening process. When you stop engaging in these behaviors before 2026 begins, you remove the resistance and your awakening can unfold naturally with the New Year's energy. This isn't about becoming a different person. It's about stopping the things that prevent you from being who you already are. Your awakened self isn't something you need to create in 2026, it's something you need to uncover by removing what's covering it right now. The first thing you must stop doing immediately, you know what I'm talking about. You have a profound meditation experience, and your first impulse is to share it in your spiritual Facebook group. You receive an intuitive insight, and you immediately need to tell someone about it to confirm it was real. You make a spiritual breakthrough, and you find yourself subtly bringing it up in conversations, hoping others will acknowledge your growth. Let me tell you about Maria, a yoga teacher who came to me frustrated that her awakening felt stuck. She had been on the spiritual path for 8 years, had profound experiences regularly, but couldn't understand why she wasn't feeling the deep transformation she was seeking. As we talked, I noticed something. Every spiritual experience she described was immediately followed by how she shared it with others and what their reactions were. I had this incredible Kundalini activation during meditation, she'd say, and when I told my spiritual mentor about it, she said it was a sign of real progress. Or, I received this download about my life purpose, and when I shared it in my women's circle, everyone was so amazed. Here's what Maria didn't realize. Every time you seek external validation for an internal spiritual experience, you leak the energy of that experience. You literally give away the power of your own awakening to other people's opinions and reactions. Spiritual experiences are meant to be metabolized internally first. They're like seeds that need to germinate in the darkness of your own consciousness before they can grow into lasting transformation. When you immediately expose them to external validation, you interrupt this natural process. But there's something even more insidious happening here. When you become addicted to spiritual validation, you unconsciously start having experiences for the story they'll make, rather than for the transformation they offer. Your ego co-opts your spiritual practice, turning it into another way to feel special or superior. The practice for these final weeks of 2025 is radical. Stop sharing your spiritual experiences immediately after they happen. Sit with them, let them integrate. Allow the energy to settle into your cells before you give it away through words. This doesn't mean you can never share spiritual insights or experiences. It means you wait until the experience is fully integrated, usually days or weeks later, before you consider sharing it. And when you do share, you share from a place of service rather than seeking validation. Notice how different it feels to hold your spiritual experiences sacred, to let them be yours first before they become stories for others. This simple shift will dramatically accelerate your awakening because you'll stop leaking your spiritual energy and start accumulating it. Your awakening doesn't need anyone else's approval to be real. In fact, seeking that approval is one of the fastest ways to make it unreal. The second pattern you must eliminate before 2026 is passive spiritual consumption. Endlessly reading, watching, and listening to spiritual content without implementing any of it in your actual life. This is the spiritual equivalent of binge-watching Netflix, except instead of feeling entertained, you feel temporarily enlightened. You follow dozens of spiritual teachers on social media. You have a library of unread spiritual books. You've bookmarked hundreds of meditation videos you'll get to someday. You consume spiritual content like it's fast food, quickly, constantly, and without much digestion. I call this spiritual bulimia, taking in massive amounts of spiritual information and then immediately seeking more without ever fully processing what you've already received. It creates the illusion of spiritual progress while actually preventing real transformation. Let me share David's story. He was a successful engineer who had been studying spirituality for over a decade. His phone was filled with spiritual podcasts, his browser had 47 bookmarked meditation channels, and he could quote dozens of spiritual teachers. But when I asked him what practices he was actually doing consistently, he went quiet. I guess I'm always looking for the right technique, he admitted. I'll start a meditation practice, but then I'll hear. David was caught in what I call the spiritual shopping syndrome, always seeking the next technique, the next teacher, the next insight that will finally be the key to his awakening. But awakening doesn't come from accumulating spiritual information. It comes from deeply embodying simple practices over time. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You already know enough to awaken, right now, with the information you already have. The problem isn't lack of knowledge, it's lack of implementation. It's the addiction to novelty over depth, to consumption over practice. The spiritual marketplace has conditioned us to believe that awakening requires constant learning, that there's always some new technique or teaching that will be the missing piece. But this keeps you perpetually in student mode, never graduating to practitioner mode. For these final weeks of 2025, I want you to implement what I call spiritual fasting. Stop consuming new spiritual content entirely. No new books, no new videos, no new podcasts, no new teachers. Instead, choose 3 simple practices you already know and commit to doing them consistently until 2026. Maybe it's a 10-minute morning meditation, a gratitude practice before bed, and a weekly nature walk in silence. Maybe it's breath work, journaling, and mindful eating. The specific practices don't matter as much as your commitment to depth over breadth. Watch what happens when you stop feeding your spiritual addiction to novelty and start nourishing your soul through consistent practice. You'll discover that awakening isn't hiding in some new teaching you haven't found yet. It's waiting in the simple practices you've been avoiding through constant seeking. Your awakening is in the implementation, not the information. The third pattern that must stop immediately is spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with practical, psychological, or emotional issues that need direct attention. This is when you say everything happens for a reason instead of taking responsibility for your choices. When you claim you're manifesting financial abundance while avoiding the practical steps needed to improve your finances. When you talk about releasing attachment instead of having difficult conversations in your relationships. Spiritual bypassing is seductive because it makes you feel enlightened while keeping you stuck. It's the ego's favorite way to co-opt spirituality, using high-minded concepts to avoid low-level work that's actually necessary for growth. Let me tell you about Jennifer, a spiritual coach who came to me because she felt like a fraud. Despite teaching manifestation workshops, her own life was falling apart. She was behind on rent, her relationship was toxic, and she had unresolved trauma from childhood that she kept trying to transcend through meditation. "I don't understand," she said. "I'm doing all the spiritual work. I meditate daily, I practice gratitude, I visualize my ideal life, but nothing's changing. Maybe I'm just not evolved enough yet." Here's what Jennifer didn't understand. She was using spirituality as a sophisticated form of avoidance. Instead of getting practical help with her finances, she was trying to manifest money. Instead of addressing her trauma through therapy, she was trying to transcend it through spiritual practice. Instead of setting boundaries in her toxic relationship, she was trying to love her way through it. Real awakening requires what I call integrated spirituality, using spiritual principles to enhance your engagement with practical reality, not to escape from it. Your awakening isn't separate from your human life. It's expressed through how skillfully you navigate your human life. If you have financial problems, awakening means becoming more conscious about money, not pretending money doesn't matter. If you have relationship issues, awakening means developing better communication. Then, for each area, identify one concrete, practical step you can take. Not a spiritual practice, not a manifestation technique, not an energy healing, a practical action in the physical world. Maybe it's creating a budget, having an honest conversation, scheduling a doctor's appointment, or updating your resume. Do these things not because they're spiritual, but because they're necessary. Do them as expressions of your awakening, not substitutes for it. True spiritual awakening makes you more effective in the world, not more detached from it. When you stop using spirituality to avoid practical reality and start using it to engage more skillfully with practical reality, your awakening becomes grounded and sustainable. Your spirit came here to have a human experience, not to escape the human experience. The fourth pattern you must eliminate is comparing your spiritual journey to others, measuring your awakening against other people's experiences, timelines, or apparent levels of consciousness. This is spiritual poison disguised as inspiration. You follow spiritual teachers on social media and wonder why you don't have their clarity. You attend spiritual gatherings and feel inadequate because others seem more advanced. You read about people having profound awakenings and judge your own progress as too slow or insufficient. Spiritual comparison is particularly toxic because it's often invisible. Unlike comparing material success where the metrics are obvious, spiritual comparison happens in subtle ways. You might think you're being inspired by someone's spiritual insights when you're actually diminishing your own journey. Let me share Marcus's story. He was a meditation teacher who had been practicing for 15 years, but he was secretly miserable. Despite having his own students and leading retreats, he felt like a spiritual failure because he hadn't experienced the dramatic awakening stories he read about online. I see these people talking about their Kundalini awakenings, their encounters with spirit guides, their profound mystical experiences, he told me. I've been meditating for 15 years, and the most dramatic thing that's happened to me is feeling really peaceful sometimes. Maybe I'm just not cut out for awakening." Marcus was suffering from what I call spiritual FOMO, fear of missing out on the right kind of awakening experience. He had internalized the idea that awakening should look a certain way, happen within a certain time frame, or include specific experiences. But awakening is as unique as fingerprints. No two people awaken in exactly the same way. Here's what Marcus didn't realize. His quiet, steady deepening into peace was exactly the awakening that was meant for him. His gift wasn't dramatic mystical experiences, it was the ability to find profound stillness in ordinary moments and teach others to do the same. The comparison trap is particularly dangerous because it makes you abandon your authentic spiritual path in favor of trying to replicate someone else's. You start practicing techniques that worked for others instead of deepening into what works for you. You chase experiences that aren't meant for your journey. Every soul has its own curriculum for awakening. Some people need dramatic breakthroughs to crack open their conditioning. Others need gentle, gradual unfolding. Some awaken through crisis, others through grace. Some through solitude, others through service. None of these paths is superior to the others. For these final weeks of 2025, implement a comparison detox. Unfollow spiritual teachers who make you feel inadequate. Stop reading awakening stories that trigger comparison. Instead, turn your attention inward and ask, what is my unique path to awakening? What does my soul need for its evolution? Start honoring your own spiritual experiences, no matter how subtle or ordinary they might seem. That moment of deep peace during morning coffee might be more significant for your awakening than someone else's vision of angels. Your awakening doesn't need to look like anyone else's to be real, profound, or complete. In fact, trying to make it look like someone else's is one of the...
This is the "when I'm awakened, then I'll" syndrome. When I'm awakened, then I'll start that creative project. When I'm awakened, then I'll have the courage to leave this job. When I'm awakened, then I'll be ready for a conscious relationship. When I'm awakened, then I'll know my life purpose. But awakening isn't a graduation ceremony where you receive a certificate that qualifies you for real living. Awakening is the process of becoming fully alive to this moment, this day, this life, exactly as it is right now. I worked with a woman named Lisa who had been preparing for awakening for 12 years. She had read hundreds of books, attended countless workshops, and completed multiple spiritual training programs. But she was still living in the same small apartment, working at the same unfulfilling job, and avoiding the same creative dreams she'd had since college. "I'm not ready yet," she would say. "I need to do more inner work first. I need to heal more trauma, release more conditioning, become more conscious. Once I'm truly awakened, then I'll know what I'm supposed to do with my life." Lisa was using the concept of awakening as a sophisticated form of procrastination. She had convinced herself that she needed to reach some perfect state of consciousness before she was qualified to live authentically. But this is backwards thinking. You don't awaken and then start living. You awaken by starting to live, by making choices from your deepest truth, by taking action aligned with your values, by engaging fully with the life you have right now. Awakening isn't a prerequisite for authentic living, it's the result of authentic living. Every time you choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, love over fear, you awaken a little more. Every time you take action aligned with your soul's calling, you embody more of your awakened self. The practice for these final weeks of 2025 is to stop waiting for permission from your future awakened self and start living as your awakening self right now. What would you do if you knew you were already awakened enough? What choices would you make? What actions would you take? Maybe you'd finally start that creative project you've been preparing for. Maybe you'd have that difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe you'd take the first step toward the career change you've been contemplating. Maybe you'd invest in that relationship, move to that place, or begin that service project. Stop treating awakening as a destination and start treating it as a vehicle. Use your current level of consciousness, however imperfect it feels, to engage more fully with your actual life. Trust that you'll awaken further through living authentically, not through waiting to live authentically. Your life is not a dress rehearsal for some future awakened version of yourself. This is it. This is your awakening. This is your life. Start living it now. The sixth pattern that must end is avoiding spiritual discomfort. Constantly seeking pleasant, peaceful, blissful spiritual experiences while running from the challenging emotions and difficult growth that real awakening requires. This is spiritual comfort addiction. The belief that awakening should feel good all the time, that spiritual growth should be a continuous upward trajectory of peace and joy. But real awakening often feels uncomfortable, disorienting, and challenging because it requires the death of old identities and the birth of new ways of being. You see this everywhere in modern spirituality. People who meditate only when they feel like it, who abandon spiritual practices the moment they become challenging, who switch teachers when their current one asks them to look at something uncomfortable about themselves. I remember working with James, a successful businessman who had been dabbling in spirituality for years, but never experienced the transformation he was seeking. He would start meditation practices, but quit when he encountered difficult emotions. He would begin therapy, but stop when it got too intense. He would join spiritual communities, but leave when they challenged his beliefs. "I don't understand," he said. "Spirituality is supposed to bring peace, right? But every time I go deeper, I feel more anxious, more confused, more emotional. Maybe I'm doing something wrong." James was experiencing what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, the inevitable period of discomfort that comes when your consciousness begins to outgrow your current identity. But instead of recognizing this as a sign of progress, he was interpreting it as a sign of failure. Here's what most people don't understand about awakening. It's not about feeling good all the time. It's about developing the capacity to be present with whatever you're feeling. It's about expanding your tolerance for the full spectrum of human experience, not just the pleasant parts. Real spiritual growth happens in the uncomfortable spaces. When you're facing your shadow, when you're questioning everything you believed about yourself, when you're feeling the grief of letting go of who you used to be. These aren't obstacles to awakening, they're the very mechanism of awakening. The practice for these final weeks of 2025 is to stop running from spiritual discomfort and start embracing it as sacred. When meditation brings up when you enter 2026 with this level of integration, you won't be seeking awakening, you'll be living it. And there you have it, the 7 patterns that are standing between you and your awakening in 2026. Seeking validation, consuming spirituality passively, spiritualizing practical problems, comparing your journey, postponing real life, avoiding discomfort, and treating spirituality as a hobby. As we stand here in these final weeks of 2025, you have a choice. You can enter 2026 carrying these same patterns, hoping that somehow this year will be different while doing the same things that have kept you stuck. Or you can use these remaining days to consciously release what no longer serves your awakening. This isn't about perfection. You don't need to eliminate all these patterns completely before January 1st, but you do need to become conscious of them. You need to start catching yourself in these behaviors and making different choices. The Year 1 energy of 2026 is going to support new beginnings like we haven't seen in years. But that energy can only work with what you give it. If you give it the same unconscious patterns, you'll get the same results. If you give it conscious choices and authentic action, you'll experience the awakening you've been seeking. Your awakening isn't hiding in some future moment when you finally get everything right. It's available right now, in this moment, through the simple act of stopping what doesn't serve and choosing what does. These 7 patterns have been running your spiritual life unconsciously. Now you know about them. Now you can choose differently. Now you can step into 2026 not as someone seeking awakening, but as someone living it. The question isn't whether you're ready for awakening. The question is whether awakening is ready for you, for the conscious, integrated, authentic version of yourself that emerges when you stop doing what keeps you asleep. 2026 is calling you to wake up, not someday, not when you're more prepared, right now. The time for spiritual procrastination is over. Your awakening begins the moment you stop doing what prevents it.
Welcome to your conscious evolution.